Welcome to the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights lecture series on race, security, and empire. We're delighted today to be hosting one of the preeminent scholars on immigration and refugee law, Dr. and Professor Heba Gowayed. Before I introduce her formally, I just want to introduce the center, which is the first and only civil rights center that focuses on civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States through a transnational, interdisciplinary, interfaith, and cross-racial approach. So I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to follow us on social media. Instagram is Rutgers CSRR, Twitter is RUCSRR, and also to follow all of our events by going to our csrr.rutgers.edu website to learn more about future events. So today I have, and my name is Sahar Aziz. I'm the executive director and also a professor of law and chancellor social justice scholar at Rutgers University Law School, also famously, notoriously known as the People's Electric Law School, institution that I'm very proud to be associated with. And today is our fifth of 6 lectures in our Race, Security, and Empire lecture series, where we'll be hosting Professor Heba Gowayed, who will discuss her book, Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend that you do, and I'm confident that after our discussion today, you will be convinced that it is well worth your time to read that book. And also, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit, we will provide that information later in the discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Gowayed. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Boston University, and her research, which is global and comparative, centers the lives of people who migrate across borders and the unequal and often violent institutions they face. She is the author of Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential, which was published with Princeton University Press. And it explores how states shape the potential of people pursuing refuge within their borders. She is currently working on her second book called The Cost of Borders, which theorizes borders as a series of costly and often deadly transactions. She is a highly sought after speaker and expert on these issues. And I am particularly proud, I must say, if you don't mind, Dr. Gowayed, to say that she's also a fellow Egyptian American. And so I'm especially delighted to be hosting a sister to present today. So we will give you the virtual floor. And then after about 20 minutes, we will open it up for Q&A. So as the audience develops questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A function of the Zoom. Welcome, marhaba, ahlan wa sahlan, Dr. Gowayed.
Thank you so much. Shukran jazilan. This is really an honor to be here for all of the same reasons, but also to speak to, Rutgers faculty and students who I've heard so much about. So if you'll bear with me, let's see if I can successfully share. Can everybody see the slides okay? Wonderful. Yes. Okay, that went off without a hitch. Just give me 1 second. I'll X out of because my view is blocked. Okay. All right, wonderful. Let's get started. So today, as Professor Aziz just very generously introduced the book, I'm going to be discussing some of the preliminary or some of the actual findings of my book, Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. And I'm going to be giving a shorter than usual talk about it because I really want to leave as much time as possible for your questions, critiques, thoughts about the project. So Refuge, which was published earlier this year, centers the experiences, is a comparative ethnography that centers the experiences of Syrians as they began new lives in the United States, Canada, and Germany. Countries that offered them resettlement and asylum, which the United Nations identifies as durable solutions to the crisis of displacement. And by that we mean, of course, human displacement. And in this project, I focus on the experiences of people who in Syria were sort of part of the middle class broadly construed. They were skilled or semi-skilled, but not highly credentialed, and they arrived to each of these countries, the United States, Canada, and Germany, between 2015 and 2016. And throughout this presentation, as the subtitle of the book suggests, I'm going to argue that human capital, which is typically examined as a crucial determinant of immigrant outcomes, is itself structured through state and corporation policies. And I'm going to show that this process of production is both gendered and racialized. But before I expand on this argument, let me first give you a background of how these men and women became refugees, which is also an explanation of their selection into each of the countries that I included in this study. So the Syrians in this study lived in cities like Homs, Syria's third largest, where this covered market once stood. And they became refugees due to a war that began in 2011 as a result of the government's violent response to civil protests for social change, the Syrian manifestation of what came to be known internationally as the Arab Spring. The war took with it the sights and sounds of their neighborhoods where the families had long lived, the homes that they had built, and of course, the lives of many of their loved ones. Facing this situation, people fled their homes, often to nearby areas, but then eventually they would flee the country. And at first, people fled to countries of immediate refuge. These are countries like Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, which continue to host upwards of 86% of everyone who is globally displaced. This influx created tensions with local residents, resulting in targeting and exploitation of Syrians who did not have legal status in these countries of immediate refuge. So for those who wanted to leave countries of immediate refuge, there were two possible solutions. One is resettlement, and the second is asylum. And resettlement is where people are selected for travel to a third country based on a measure of their vulnerability. Which can be things like chronic illness, having a lot of young children, etc. Importantly, when offered resettlement in a given country, they can say yes or no, but they cannot choose the destination itself. Prior to the Trump administration, when refugees were admitted, the United States, as well as Canada, led the world on admissions through resettlement. Still, resettlement globally has always been a hyper rare solution. So only 1% of those displaced are ever really resettled. And I imagine the numbers in the last couple of years has even declined further as resettlement opportunities, including the United States, remain limited. So for those not offered resettlement, the other solution to displacement is asylum. I'm sure many of you remember watching in the summer of 2015 as almost 1 million people, with the help of smugglers, made the treacherous journey across the Aegean Sea and blow up rafts and into Europe. Asylum is where one stakes his or her claim in a country that could offer them legal status by showing up there and applying. And by some estimates, Germany took in about 500,000 Syrian asylees between 2015 and 2016. But by the time the Syrian men and women in the study had arrived to each of the United States, Canada, and Germany, they'd experienced a number of significant losses that sort of troubles this idea of resettlement and asylum as solutions, right? They'd lost their country, arriving to a new one where the adat wa taqalid, or norms and traditions, were entirely different, whose language was not their mother tongue, and where there would be ethnic, religious, and racial minorities stigmatized by association to terrorism. They'd resigned themselves to not seeing family for the foreseeable future. But what's more, they would experience a dimming of their potential. By this, I mean in countries of resettlement and asylum, their skills and abilities, or their human capital, did not have the same resonance that they did in Syria. And the question that I ask is why? So the term human capital, central to studies in economics, refers to individual abilities and qualities that make workers productive, often in an economic market. Sociologists have shown that human capital is an important determinant of socioeconomic mobility alongside the characteristics of the receiving context. And this is particularly true for first-generation immigrants. In other words, this literature shows that human capital and context together shape immigrant outcomes. Human capital in this literature is typically measured cross-sectionally, as years of education or occupational histories at a moment in time. It's imagined as something that immigrants bring with them, an independent variable that then shapes other outcomes. However, this leaves the question: if one had 5 years of Syrian public school education or held an occupation as an artisan in Syria, How does this actually matter for their productivity in a destination economy? This question has been of interest as well to economists who identified what they call the, quote, imperfect transferability of human capital for immigrants who are moving across disparate contexts. It's also been of interest to others who show that migration as a process is disruptive to human capital. And some have tried to explain this discrepancy. So human capital theorists explain it by suggesting that immigrants actually must lack necessary skills. Signaling theorists argue that this explanation doesn't make sense because skills aren't something you can see, they're not a tangible object or something that you can measure with a yardstick. Instead, they hold that immigrant skills and credentials are illegible to employers because they're foreign to them and they're hard to read, right? They're hard to sort of discern, and that it's really irrelevant to whatever skills they actually hold. Yet other theorists show that the reading of skills is shaped by racism, or that the skills of minoritized groups are always seen as inferior to those of a majority group. However, all of these explanations continue to treat the immigrant as a puzzle piece entering the labor market puzzle. But what of the state which governs the entire process of migration? In this study, I introduce a theory of state-structured human capital to answer this question. I argue, looking at the early period and through a comparative approach, that human capital can be created, transformed, or destroyed through the incorporation policies of receiving countries, which derive from national approaches to social welfare. I find that incorporation systems can intervene in two ways. First, they can recognize or ignore immigrant histories, seeing people as unskilled who may in fact have skills that could be activated. This has always mattered for highly skilled immigrants, people like doctors or lawyers. But also today I'm going to tell you about Amin, who arrives to Germany after working his whole life as a truck driver there. And I show that this history of working as a truck driver only matters if the German government recognizing it as mattering to becoming a truck driver in Germany. Second, states can invest in newcomer refugee skills so that refugees can translate their histories in ways that are productive in a new setting or enable them to acquire new skills that matter in that setting. So for instance, states can provide new language learning classes, teach refugees a new skill that is needed in the receiving economy that they did not previously have. States can also provide financial assistance to allow refugees to benefit from existing skill building opportunities. So for these reasons, I argue that human capital is not only a determinant of immigrant outcomes, but also an outcome structured by state incorporation policies. I also show that the production of human capital is gendered. As scholars of gender have shown, institutions and services themselves feature gender expectations of who is a worker. And these interact with Syrian refugee expectations, where men are often primary breadwinners, resulting in different, and as I will show sometimes surprising outcomes for women and men. And I show that the production of human capital is racialized. Countries equip new arrivals in their pursuit of a good, stable life through the same racist social welfare systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. But what's more, as scholars of race have shown, discrimination and racist violence diminishes possibilities. Here we see it both in the denial of opportunities to minoritized people and through their own fear of being in public space. I'm going to show that this was particularly bad for hijabi women whose identity is more conspicuous in Western contexts. The project also builds on broader work on immigrant reception. While studies of immigration have often focused on long-term outcomes or how immigrants fit into notions of a national whole, I join others who take what I call a human-centric approach, asking instead how a nation's policies work in the lives of immigrants. I focus on the understudied and crucial initial years in which newcomer histories collide with new systems to coalesce into their first designations of race, of legal status, and of course, human capital. And this early period is crucial as it shapes immigrants' starting positions in new countries. I also focus specifically on social welfare policies from which social assistance to immigrants derives. Okay, so what do these policies look like in the three countries I center in this study? What do the policies of reception look like? So first, in the United States, what we have is a liberal market economy, which owing to anti-Black racism, limits the role of the state and treats poverty as an individual failure. Refugees who arrive receive limited federal assistance and their only regular cash assistance is from temporary assistance for needy families, which is TANF, which is the national welfare policy introduced, of course, in 1996 with the welfare reforms. So the goal of this assistance and the goal for refugees, as explicitly laid out in the 1980 Refugee Act, is for, quote, self-sufficiency or non-reliance on government assistance. The idea that low-income people should quickly sort of depend on themselves rather than continuing to receive that assistance from the state. Canada is also a liberal market economy, but characterized by what's been called inclusive liberalism. So the social service system in Canada is generous, right? Think universal welfare. This generosity features an immigrant incorporation premised on the idea of multiculturalism, or the government's desire to integrate immigrants into the fabric of its society through investing in them. In this way, with the express goal of integration, refugees are met in Canada. Finally, Germany is a corporatist system, which means that the national economy is organized by coordination between the state unions and employers to the perceived or assumed benefit of all three. And this system includes high levels of expenditure on social programs, which Meyer-Marx-Free, for instance, has described as producing the nation, which is seen as a nation primarily of Germanic people. So Syrians entering the system benefit from the generous financial assistance from the German state. However, it comes with conditions. First, to learn German, and then to earn a German credential required to enter the German labor market, something that 86% of all German workers also hold. So as a result of this, I call this third system one of credentialization. Okay, so how did newly arrived Syrians experience these systems? Before I get into data, let me offer a brief explanation of methods. So to compile the neat data collection chart on the screen involved an ethnography conducted in 3 countries over the span of 3 years. And the project was conducted in Arabic, a language in which I'm fluent, and families selected a language in which I'm fluent. And I would love to talk more about methods in the Q&A because I made a lot of decisions when writing this book centering this idea that I have that consent isn't a question sort of asked and answered, but an ongoing relationship of dignity and mutual respect. And so, examples of ways that I did this is that, and particularly took the human-centric approach in my theory to this methodological approach, is in the choice, for instance, not to use the term refugee unless I'm describing somebody's legal status versus using it, to identify the person outside of that legal status. And I also, for instance, had people who had sought refuge in each of these 3 countries write an afterword to a book in order to sort of preserve their voice in the text itself. But for now, what's really important to know in order to follow the findings which I'm about to present is that the people in the study came from similar backgrounds. They were mostly middle-class people. Men had jobs prior to, they had occupations. The women, for the most part, with notable exceptions, stayed home. And people arrived to each of these 3 countries in a similar time frame. So what we really have is very similar people having experiences that are differentiated by sort of which country they ended up in. Okay. So with that, let's get to the data. So to organize findings in each case, I describe how refugees experience their arrival and the assistance that they receive from the state. I then explore how each system structured the human capital of newly arrived refugees and how that experience was different for women and men. And I begin with the case of the United States and how men and women adjusted to the self-sufficiency imperative of resettlement policy. Here, I highlight the case of Roger and Majid, who just 7 years ago were a middle-class couple living in Homs, Syria, just around the corner from the covered market that I showed you earlier in the presentation. And in 2010, they'd finally achieved their dream of building their own home, leaving the foundations in place to build additional floors for each of their 3 children, the oldest of whom was a preteen at the time. Their enjoyment of this dream was short-lived, however. In 2011, they fled to Jordan, where Majid, who had owned his own restaurant, became an undocumented worker at a shawarma stand. This couple, along with their 3 children, arrived to JFK in October of 2015. An international organization for migration van drove them from JFK to New Haven, Connecticut. They were dropped off in a dimly lit parking lot of an off-track betting facility at the edge of town. They piled into the car of the resettlement agency caseworker and made their way to a low-income neighborhood of the post-industrial city. Their apartment was on the second floor of what used to be a single-family home, and they would soon realize that it had a mouse infestation. There, the couple would be visited by the caseworker who would tell them what their assistance would be. During this meeting, they learned about TANF, the welfare system, for the first time. They would receive $803 per month, the benefit of a family of 5. They would also receive a comparable amount in food stamps through an electronic benefit transfer, EBT, that could only go towards food items. At this meeting, they also learned that their rent was $1,000 a month, right? So the assistance is $800, but their rent is $1,000. So here's a budget of another family early in their resettlement. So because people don't read English, on the left is a clip art of each expense. And each column header is the month, which this family had translated into their Arabic names. Yellow highlighter is the welcome money, federal funding, which is $975 per refugee, a one-time payment. And in green is what the family is expected to pay out of pocket. As you can see, for the first 3 to 6 months, for the first 3 to 6 months, the resettlement agency will help the family pay their rent using a mix of this federal funding called welcome money, as well as donations to the agency. But then the family would be expected to pay half of their own TANF benefit to cover the rest of that expense. But when this assistance was up, TANF cash alone was insufficient to cover the rent. There was no discussion in this family as to who would find a job. As the household's breadwinner, Mejid felt that this was his responsibility. And this brings us to the issue of state-structured human capital tied to labor market entry. Mejid lacked an effective social network. His friends had also just been resettled and were as poor as he was. However, through a contact at the mosque, he was referred to an Egyptian pizza store owner. And there he helped in the kitchen. Mejid earned minimum wage at this job. Due to the nature of the job, however, he had no control over his shifts. Though he tried to attend English classes, his work schedule was unpredictable. He also did not have the energy or time to study after his shift. Low-income work in the United States is characterized by this kind of precarity, unpredictable schedules, a lack of a living wage, and de-skilling. In Syria, the men in this sample were carpenters, electricians, contractors, chefs, and restaurant owners. When they met each other in the United States, they introduced themselves, listing their mihan, or occupations. In the United States, they did not work these mihan. They worked low-wage jobs. They were dishwashers, janitors, gas station attendants, where coworkers did not speak English and where they did not have the energy or time to attend English classes after work. So as one man put it, I want to work, but I'm new here. We just got here. We don't understand anything, but you want to push me to work. So we work whatever, hayallah. Most work in restaurants, doing whatever. Everyone is working against their will. No one is happy. In other countries, they allow us to study. To get assistance, they say, you're not allowed to work so you can learn. Not here. Meanwhile, after the kids enrolled in school, Roget and the other women began to attend English classes in the morning. By staying out of the labor market, the women had the opportunity to build new human capital. The English they were learning enabled the women to do a series of tasks that their husbands could not. They could communicate with service providers and resettlement agency staff. They could advocate for their children in school, and they were building up for the citizenship exam that they would take in 5 years' time. In addition, within a year of their resettlement, most women took on some kind of income-earning work. The women utilized the skills that they previously had. For instance, Roget crocheted baby clothes and flower pins. 26-year-old Gheda, whose husband Zafar had told me with finality, our wives don't work, did work. She prepared halawat al-laban and kunafa, which are sweets that her husband sold to other co-ethnics. And so in this way, the women reimagined their existing human capital for new labor market returns. However, as I learned when I began citizenship classes with this group earlier this year, actually last year, even for women, the gains were short-lived. None of the activities, because they were not earned with a pay stub, were recognized by the Department of Social Services as qualified work. The women could not receive limited federal child care subsidies to pursue them. And as families settled in, babies were born. Sara joked, Donald Trump is trying to keep Syrians out of the country, but look at us, we're making more Syrians here. With nowhere to leave their children, the women dropped out of English classes. Also into the work of Professor Sahar Aziz, it is important to note that women were hindered in their pursuit of language as a result of anti-Muslim racism. On your screen is a hateful message sent to the mosque in 2016. As hate crimes against Muslims spiked, including incidents against people in this study, they shied away from being outdoors on their own. Heba, for instance, stopped going to English class altogether after her family was attacked, and Roget stopped going for a period of time. 5 years after their arrival, none of the men and very few of the women had enough English to qualify for the citizenship exam, a crucial barrier to inclusion and protection against policies like the travel ban that reduce their feelings of safety and security in the United States. So now that I've given you the case of the United States, let me turn briefly to the case of Canada. So a drive 500 miles north of New Haven takes us to Toronto, where Denya, a relative of one of the families in New Haven, lived with her husband and 4 children. Denya has a laugh that can be heard ringing down the hallway of her apartment building, and her husband Bassem, who is a good deal older than her, owned his own restaurant in Homs like Majid did. When Bassem and Denya arrived in Canada, Costi, an organization that was managing resettlement on behalf of the Canadian government, housed them in a hotel. They could choose where they lived, and they chose to live in Mississauga, an area with a large Arab community. Other families chose to live in other places, but also next to other Arabs, and including other Arabs who they had arrived with. The Canadian government gave the families a startup allowance of $5,000 to cover first and last month's rent. But the government also provided new arrivals with standard issue new furniture for their home and cash assistance of $1,600 a month, $800 per parent, in addition to a Canadian child benefit of approximately $450 per school-aged child. After their first year, they could also receive welfare. And the Canadian government saw this transition to welfare as normal. They said when income support from the government or private sponsors ends after 12 months, in most cases, it is a normal occurrence for some refugees to transition to provincial or territorial social assistance support, right? Sounds very much like the American government. Denya and Bassem's rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in this high-rise was $1,400 a month, which they would cover and exceed with this assistance. So as a result, they didn't have to follow the timeline of families in the United States. They could wait to enter the labor market. In fact, they were incentivized to do so. And this brings us to the issue of state-structured human capital, right? Unlike in the United States, where men had to enter the labor market early and women were the ones who could learn English, in Canada, the opportunity was available for both women and men. And so each morning, Bassem and Denya attended English classes. And when I met them, they were even able to have telephone conversations, which were something that is very difficult in a second language. And while there was variation in the sample as to who attended the English classes regularly, everyone reported that they were available and that there were also other opportunities to gain education or skills. And while skills were in a sense uneven, or recognition of skills was in a sense uneven, which is a huge issue in the Canadian case, the existence of these educational opportunities to an extent offset that. So Denya, for instance, who hadn't worked before, told me in her usual jovial demeanor that Denya who cooks and cleans is over, khalas. She was going to enroll in classes to do hair. So it's important to note that in Canada, too, there was hate crimes against Muslims, almost as high as in the United States if you just take the statistical difference. However, the families in this study felt in a sense insulated from this hate. And one of the reasons I think is that they could choose to live next to other co-ethnics. But also another reason is that Canada has an active policy of the promotion of multiculturalism and inclusivity by law, which means that these instrumental and symbolic supports do exist, whether that be radio programming in people's languages, but also the investment in language learning, which can contribute to a general sense of belonging. Okay, so finally, what about the case of Germany? So arrival in the German case of asylum is more dangerous than either of the cases of resettlement. And that's because people had to travel very long distances in order to get to Germany and apply there. So Iman and Amin and their 3 children arrived in Germany in the summer of 2015. Amin is the long-haul truck driver that I'd mentioned earlier, and he had been imprisoned in Syria. After he was released by the intervention of his boss, the family decided that it was time to flee the country. First, they lived in Turkey, and then they got on the raft to Greece. And after an 18-day trek through Europe, including 3 days of detainment in Hungary, they arrived to Germany, but only stayed there because they couldn't afford to travel further to their intended Sweden. After a welcoming arrival in Germany, that brought Imen to tears, they spent 2 days in a police camp in Leipzig, at which point they secured their 3-year temporary residency. This was a quick turnaround. Typically, the process in Germany takes quite a bit longer, and I'm happy to talk more about that, the legal dimensions of that. So Imen and Amin received assistance from the German government through the job center, where all unemployment assistance is distributed in Germany. And their rent in Dusseldorf was covered by the job center, and they received a basic monthly amount that could exceed their needs and also allowed them to send money home once in a while. So like in Canada, refugees' language learning is the issue of first concern for the German government. However, unlike in Ontario, Syrian refugees are required to attend German classes under a penalty of the reduction of their assistance. So both Amin and Imen enrolled in class. And in order to secure work in Germany, they'd have to accomplish at least a B1 level of German. And this meant succeeding in 4 courses, 3 A levels, and the first is the B level, which would take a minimum of a year and more realistically 2, particularly for people who were illiterate in Arabic. The classes also taught basics about German culture and law. But then, if Amin wanted to be a truck driver in Germany, he would need to do a training called an Ausbildung for an additional 3 years. This meant that his experience as a truck driver, the fact that he'd gotten arrested and tortured in prison as a result of this occupation, was irrelevant. It wasn't seen by the German state as qualifying Amin to work. And this made the Syrian refugees feel inadequate. As Odey, a 31-year-old former mechanic, said, "The Germans see themselves here," putting his head flat to his forehead, his hand flat to his forehead. "If you want to be with us, then you have to catch up with us. When you get here, it's like you're a newborn." However, for women and young people who didn't have prior work experience, the credentialization requirement, in a sense, cleared a pathway to the labor market. Yara, for instance, who had gotten married quite young and who dropped out of school young, felt that in Germany, she was going to become a dental assistant. 3 years after arriving, she was finishing up her B1 and in the process of applying for an Ausbildung. However, here too, it's important to highlight the role of racism in shaping the experiences of new arrivals. The image of your screen is of hateful messages one woman received in her mailbox from a neighbor. Not only did new arrivals see the policies of the German state as exclusionary, or a system that, quote, worked better for a German system that works well for the Germans, but also they felt that they were expected to relinquish parts of their identities to better fit into notions of German culture. In Germany, where Turkish people are a substantial immigrant minority, estimated to be about 5% of the German population, the Syrians are racialized as Muslim in relation to this group that is perceived to not want to assimilate. And there was particular discrimination faced by women who wear the hijab, who, for instance, one of whom was denied an opportunity to get an Ausbildung as a daycare because, quote, she was told, quote, it would send the wrong message to the children. So now that I presented my data, let me conclude to return to my main argument. The global ethnography advances the theory of state-structured human capital by showing that human capital, often conceptualized as a determinant of refugee outcomes, is actually a product of national incorporation policy, and specifically whether countries are willing to invest in and recognize refugee potential. And this process of investment is both racialized and gendered. And there are 3 key implications that I'm going to leave you with, as I think we're probably over time. So first, in accounts of refugee crises and in international laws, as you all know, refugees are often cast as victims, and receiving states that offer these durable solutions are cast as saviors. And implicit to this is the racist idea that life in the West is necessarily a privilege, and therefore countries are accomplishing their humanitarian commitment simply by admitting refugees. But admission into American poverty is no one's salvation. Indeed, wealthy countries that receive refugees, including the United States, Canada, and Germany, are also complicit in the colonial legacies, foreign military interventions, and environmental degradations that create the very conditions from which refugees are fleeing. And within their borders, they too are capable of violence, the violence of minoritizing, of denying living wages, of a non-recognition of people's humanity. This project captures how countries equip new arrivals for their pursuit of a good, stable life through the very same systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. Following, observing how human capital of those seeking refuge is structured reveals the ways in which it matters well beyond the labor market. Language acquisition is necessary for everything from making friends to securing citizenship in all 3 of these countries. And the ability to express human potential is also emotionally important. How would any of us feel if everything we had accomplished and built in our lives became suddenly meaningless to everyone around us? Finally, the study has implications well beyond the case of refugees or even immigrants. Through the design that follows the simultaneous experience of people seeking refuge who are strangers to the systems of social welfare, we raise a mirror to these systems themselves and how they shape inequality more broadly. The national incorporation systems that structure the human capital of refugees are the very same systems which low-income people have traversed across these three countries well before this cohort of Syrians arrived. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Gowayed. That was so informative. And I will just repeat what I said earlier in the presentation, which is if you have not read her book, Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential, I highly recommend it. And this just corroborates the tremendous value that your research has added. So while I'm going to ask you just a few questions and use my moderator's prerogative, and while I do, I'll encourage the audience to post their questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. So first I'll just say that there's a quote, a statement you made that you should put on you should frame, which is admission to American poverty is no salvation. And I think that very few people understand that that's effectively what happens, unfortunately, through the refugee resettlement process. Even if that's not necessarily the intent. So I wanted to ask you more about what you think is the reasoning behind these different models of refugee resettlement. You laid out to some extent this labor market economic argument, implying that tends to be, or I presume, maybe the primary lens through which refugee resettlement programs are crafted. So one, is that in fact the reason why you have these differences? Or is there more to it that's based on politics, social norms, views towards people seeking refuge? But what explains this difference, for example, in the United States with the self-sufficiency approach, as opposed to Canada and Germany, which tend to be more generous? Why do they approach it this way? And why do you think America approaches it our way?
Yeah, I think that, and people have written about this extensively, particularly in the case of the United States. I think that the work of Sibel Fox, for instance, is really indicative of this particular case, which is that the progression of the American welfare system is hinged on anti-Black racism and also, against Mexican immigrants, right? So it's also anti-immigration. And the idea, even with the 1996 welfare reforms, right, it's called the Personal Responsibility for Work Act, right? So it's this idea that in the United States, we have this imagination of poverty because of sort of the racial inequalities that structure the United States fundamentally. We have this imagination of poverty as an individual failure. If you're poor, it's not structural. It's not because of segregation. It's not because your school was defunded. It's not because you have chronic health issues. It's not because we're not investing in your health care. It's not because there is no mental health care in this country, for instance. It's because you are just not doing what you're supposed to be doing in order to make ends meet. And there's a really interesting book by Daniel Zuberi that compares what poverty looks like in the United States and Canada. So it's not that there's less poverty in Canada. The numbers are actually pretty comparable. It's that the experience of being poor in Canada is fundamentally different because you have these social safety nets. So dollar for dollar, you have the same amounts of earnings. Your experience of poverty in Canada is quite different. So I do think this notion of race and the division of race does matter because Canada has this understanding of itself as a multicultural society. And it's not that that doesn't include racism, but it's this idea that, we should work together and that people who are arriving should be integrated. And it's facilitated, of course, by skill-based migration, right? So in the 1960s, Canada and the United States kind of bifurcate, right? And for reasons of white supremacy. So in the United States, the argument is made that our immigration policy should be based on family reunification. And if it's based on family reunification, then it's going to stay white because prior to the 1960s, white people were the ones admitted due to all the restrictive and racist immigration policies that we had in place. In Canada, the idea was to select based on skill, What that means in Canada is that there isn't as much welfare, concern, right? There isn't this image of immigrants coming to take our resources, and that's because the immigrants are highly skilled. So immigrants actually, on average, have better outcomes and better, incomes than their Canadian white, born counterparts. So, which is actually shifting in recent years due to changes, some policy changes. So I do really think. And Germany has an image of itself as being not a country of migration, right? So until the year 2010, they didn't even have, until the year 2000, they didn't even have a way for anybody with non-Germanic blood to become German. And they identified themselves as, in their constitution as not being a country of migration. And so this homogenous, imagination, despite the fact that it was a country of migration, but the homogenous imagination of Germany is what makes it so that it's a super generous system, but it's structured entirely around Germans. There's no understanding of people coming from the outside. So I do think race plays a huge role in determining what these three systems look like and why we have such discrepancy in how people are received.
That's so fascinating. And I'll just note before I go to the Q&A is how there isn't even an exceptional approach to refugees. I mean, notwithstanding all of the flaws and racist treatment of low-income people in America, which is highly racialized. So, putting aside that critique, which is a valid critique, but what's also interesting is that our nation and our people and our law does not even recognize that when someone is new to this country, they're not even, they weren't born here, they didn't live here. Whatever circumstances they find themselves in when they arrive, whether they're coming with a tremendous amount of wealth or whether they're coming with only the clothes on their back as refugees, we don't even acknowledge that, we don't differentiate between those experiences. And I find that to also be quite inhumane and completely contradictory to the concept of allowing refugees in and acknowledging that refugees have a particularly uniquely difficult set of circumstances by virtue of how they've arrived. So that's a great observation. Thank you so much, Professor Gowayed, for such an informative and enlightening presentation, and for bringing a different perspective that unfortunately is not the mainstream one in the media, but I think as more scholars like you continue to write both scholarship and also op-eds and other publicly accessible information or products, I think we'll hopefully start to shape public opinion that's based on accuracy rather than stereotypes and racism. And so I will just end by thanking everyone for attending our talk today with Professor Heba Gowayed. I will encourage you to read her book, Refuge, When the State Shapes Human, How the State Shapes Human Potential. I can't wait to read your next book, The Costs of Borders. And please do follow the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, csrr.rutgers.edu, and on our social media. And then finally, we have we actually have 2 lectures coming up this semester. We just added a new one. The next one is with George Bisharat, professor at UC Hastings School of Law, who will be talking about international social movements and using international law to defend Palestinian human rights. And that's on March 29th at noon. And we also have another talk with Professor Tanya Hernandez at Fordham Law School, who will be talking about her book, Racial Innocence, Anti-Black Racism Within Latino Communities. So we look forward to seeing you all again online. Thank you again, Professor Gowayed. Ma salama, everyone, and we'll see you on March 29th.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, Sahar, for having me. Ma salama, everybody.
Ma salama.